For decades, if China wanted to move goods to Europe by land, there was essentially one option: a single railway line running through Russia, controlled by Russia, earning billions of dollars in transit fees every year. Russia knew it and used it as quiet leverage over the world's largest trading relationship. Then something changed. China is now building a completely different route, one that cuts Russia out entirely. And the economic and strategic consequences of that decision are bigger than almost anyone in the West has properly reported. This is the story of the new China-Europe rail corridor, why it exists, how it works, and why it is quietly reshaping the balance of power across Eurasia. And the way China found out Russia could be cut out? It started with a single government document, a directive issued on 1 October morning in 2024. We will get to what was in it and why it changed everything. To understand why this route matters so much, you need to go back to the basics of how China and Europe trade with each other. China is the world's largest manufacturer. Europe is one of its biggest markets. The two continents are separated by roughly 10,000 kilometers. For most of modern history, the answer to that distance was simple: ships. Cargo loaded onto container vessels in Chinese ports, sailing south through the South China Sea, west through the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal, and into European ports. The journey takes 30 to 40 days. It is slow, but it is cheap, and it can handle enormous volume. But in 2011, China started something different: a freight train service, running directly overland from China to Europe, no ocean required. The journey, roughly 10,000 kilometers of rail, crossing Central Asia and into the heart of the European continent. By 2024, this service was running more than 19,000 train trips per year, carrying goods worth $66 billion annually. Those are not projections. That is what the network delivered last year, according to China Railway Container Transport statistics. But here is the part the headline numbers do not immediately tell you. The vast majority of those trains, for most of the route's history, have run through Russia. That arrangement worked well for a long time. Russia earned transit fees. China got its goods to Europe faster. European buyers received their shipments in 12 to 18 days instead of 30 to 40 by sea. Three parties, three sets of interests, all temporarily aligned. There is one country in this story that nobody expected to become the most important player in the new corridor. It is not China. It is not Germany. We will get there. Then, February 2022 arrived. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Western governments responded with an extensive package of economic sanctions, targeting Russian banks, Russian energy exports, and Russian institutions. For the China-Europe rail network, this created an immediate problem. European companies became deeply reluctant to move cargo through Russian territory, not just for political reasons, though those were real, but for practical ones. Western sanctions made financial transactions with Russian entities complicated. Insurance for cargo transiting Russia became harder to obtain. Customs procedures at the Russian-Polish border became slower and more unpredictable. Some logistics companies simply told their clients, "We are not routing through Russia anymore. Find another way." For a while, another way was not obvious. The Russian route had one very significant advantage. It was fast. Transit through Russia from the Chinese border to the EU border takes just 5 to 7 days, making the total China to Europe journey competitive with anything else on the map. The alternative routes existed, but they were slower, more expensive, and far less developed. So, for the first 2 years after the invasion, many companies quietly continued routing through Russia, even as they publicly distanced themselves from Moscow. And then Russia did something that permanently changed the calculation. In October 2024, the Russian government issued Directive number 1374. Without prior warning, it banned a broad range of goods from transiting Russian territory, specifically targeting electronics, machinery, and certain textiles classified as having potential military applications.
Chinese companies woke up to find containers already moving through Russia suddenly stopped at the border. No warning, no transition period. Cargo held indefinitely. It was a sharp message from Moscow to Beijing, a reminder that China's access to its own trade route ran through Russian territory, on Russian terms. For Beijing's economic planners, it confirmed something they had suspected for years. Relying on Russia as the bridge between China and Europe was a structural vulnerability, not a partnership. The search for a route that did not touch Russian soil became urgent. What they found was not just a route. It was something that would make Russia's October 2024 decision look like one of the worst strategic miscalculations in modern trade history.
The route that is now emerging as the main alternative has a straightforward name: the Middle Corridor. It starts in China. Trains head west across the Xinjiang region into Kazakhstan. From Kazakhstan, cargo reaches the Caspian Sea, where it is loaded onto ships crossing to Azerbaijan. In Baku, it transfers back to rail and moves through Georgia to the Turkish border. From Turkey, through the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars Railway and the Marmaray Tunnel under the Istanbul Strait, it connects to the broader European rail network. The entire route bypasses Russia completely. Belarus, too. The corridor runs south of both countries, through Central Asia and the Caucasus. Now, this route has real advantages and real challenges. Both are worth being honest about. The advantages. First, distance and speed. The Middle Corridor is approximately 2,500 kilometers shorter than the old northern route through Russia. Transit times from China to Europe run at 10 to 15 days, competitive with the Russian route and dramatically faster than sea freight. Second, geopolitical independence. The route passes through Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, none subject to Western sanctions. European importers can use it without the legal and financial complications of routing through Russia. The European Union has committed over 10 billion euros to developing transport infrastructure along this corridor, because Brussels sees reducing dependence on Russian-controlled trade routes as a strategic priority. Third, and this is the part nobody saw coming, Turkey. Ankara has moved faster and more aggressively than any other country to position itself as the essential hub of this corridor. Turkey now sits at the exact point where the corridor enters Europe, and Ankara understands precisely what that means. Whichever country controls the critical transit point between China and Europe gains enormous economic leverage and diplomatic weight. For Turkey, the Middle Corridor is not a logistics opportunity. It is a foreign policy instrument, a way to make itself indispensable to both sides of the world's most important trading relationship simultaneously. The honest challenges. The Middle Corridor is not yet a full replacement for the Russian route. Capacity is the most significant gap. The Russian route can handle around 1.5 million containers per year. The Middle Corridor's current capacity is closer to 300,000. A fraction of that. This gap does not close quickly. Complexity is also higher. The route crosses more countries, involves a sea crossing on the Caspian, and requires gauge changes, different track widths, at several transition points. Each additional step adds cost and friction. This is not a finished highway. It is a road being actively built, under serious geopolitical pressure, with investment flowing in from multiple directions simultaneously. Every major infrastructure project like this creates unexpected winners. One city in Europe is quietly becoming the most strategically important logistics hub on the continent. Not because of anything it did, but simply because of where it sits on the new map. We will name it in a moment. Here is the question the investment numbers actually answer. Who wins if this corridor succeeds? Start with China and the European Union. Both are funding this corridor, but for very different reasons. China is funding it because the alternative, permanent dependency on a Russian-controlled route, became strategically unacceptable after October 2024. The China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan Railway, a new 900-kilometer rail line connecting western China more directly into Central Asia, carries an estimated cost of $8 billion. For Beijing, that is not a logistics investment. It is a sovereignty investment, the price of not needing Moscow's permission to reach its own customers. The European Union is funding it for the opposite reason. Brussels wants to reduce European dependence on Russian-controlled infrastructure, not just for Ukraine-related political reasons, but as a long-term structural objective. Over 10 billion euros committed, not as aid, as strategic infrastructure spending on Europe's own supply chain resilience. Same corridor, two funders, two entirely different strategic rationales, both aligned on the outcome. Kazakhstan wins by becoming the geographic center of the new network. The country is expanding its railway terminals and the port of Aktau on the Caspian coast. Its position as the essential gateway between China and the rest of Eurasia is an economic asset of the first order, one that geography handed it, and investment is now converting into structural leverage. Turkey wins by becoming the European entry point, as we covered, and Ankara is not being subtle about it. And then there is the city nobody in the conversation mentions, but that the freight trains keep arriving at regardless. Duisburg, Western Germany, already the largest inland port in Europe, connected to the Rhine River system and the dense rail network feeding into the European industrial heartland. More than half of all China-Europe freight trains that arrive in Europe terminate in or pass through Duisburg. The city did not compete for this position. Geography placed it there. And now it is investing aggressively to hold that advantage, because the numbers keep growing and Duisburg knows it. In 2016, the annual value of goods moving on this rail network was $8 billion. By 2024, it had reached $66 billion. The investments being made today are bets that within a decade, that figure is substantially higher again.
Now step back from the logistics entirely, because what is actually happening here is larger than a railway. Russia built its position in Eurasian trade over more than a century. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the original land route connecting Asia to Europe through Russian territory, was completed in 1904. For over 100 years, Russia's geography was its leverage. Any country that wanted to move goods overland between the Pacific and Europe had to go through Russian territory, pay Russian transit fees, and operate on Russian terms. That leverage is now being systematically reduced, not by military force, not by sanctions, but by investment in a parallel infrastructure that makes Russia unnecessary. But there is one variable in this story that nobody has fully resolved yet. And it could either accelerate this shift by a decade or throw the whole corridor into serious uncertainty. It depends entirely on what happens in one country. We will get to it before the end of this section. Consider what Russia loses as the middle corridor grows. Transit fee revenue falls. The economic argument for shipping through Russia weakens. Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey all gain in economic importance as Russia loses it. And Russia's ability to use its geography as quiet diplomatic leverage over China diminishes with every container that takes the southern route instead. This is why Russia's October 2024 decision to block transit goods without warning reads less like a trade policy and more like a strategic mistake. Rather than making itself more attractive as a transit partner, Moscow reminded Beijing of exactly why an alternative was needed. China's response, accelerating investment in routes that do not require Russian permission, was entirely predictable. Geography is only a permanent strategic asset until someone builds around it. Russia spent decades assuming its position on the map was fixed leverage. The middle corridor is demonstrating in real time that it is not. China is building around it. The EU is funding it. Central Asian economies are betting their futures on it. The variable is Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member, still formally committed to the Western Security Alliance.
It has long-standing EU membership ambitions, but its foreign policy has moved consistently towards strategic independence, maintaining ties with Russia even during the Ukraine conflict, purchasing Russian military systems while under NATO membership, positioning itself as a mediator that answers to nobody fully. If Turkey's geopolitical alignment shifts sharply toward Moscow or into extended confrontation with the West, its role as the essential European entry point of the Middle Corridor becomes uncertain. That uncertainty has no clean resolution right now. It is the live variable that China, the EU, and every logistics company routing through the corridor is watching closely. What is already certain is this: a century of Russian transit leverage, built on geography and the absence of alternatives, is now being unwound. The question is the speed, and Turkey holds a meaningful part of that answer. Infrastructure decisions made today shape geopolitical realities for decades. The China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan railway will take years to complete. The Caspian ferry network will take years to reach full capacity. Turkey's alignment will take years, possibly a decade, to fully clarify. But the direction is clear. The investment is real. And the strategic logic for China, for Europe, for the corridor countries, all points the same way. That is how power shifts in the modern world, not in a single moment, quietly, through infrastructure. One thing I would genuinely like to know before you go: do you think the Middle Corridor can reach full capacity and truly replace the Russian route within a decade? Or does Turkey's unpredictable alignment make that too uncertain? Drop your take in the comments. The debate in there is consistently sharper than anything you will read in a news article. Power does not announce itself. It moves through pipelines, railways, and shipping lanes, quietly, until the map has already changed. If you want to keep seeing the map before it changes, subscribe. That is what this channel is for. And while you are here, the story we covered in our last video sits right at the center of everything we just discussed. It is called 9 Hidden Choke Points Holding the World Economy Hostage. The rail corridor China is building? It exists partly because of what those 9 passages represent. Watch that video and the two stories will click together in a way that neither one does on its own. It is on the screen right now.